Dear Baba, my name is Lisa Cobb, and I'm really pleased to introduce probably the most experienced speaker of all, Allan Cohen, who, under Baba's direction, has given over 2,000 talks on helping people stay away from drugs, 500 in 1 year. So it's my pleasure. I don't want to take any more time. Turn it over to Allan, and then my question for you is, how did you begin your correspondence with Mayor Baba?
Thank you, Clay. I think that it's too bad we didn't get a chance to interview you. It's dangerous. It's nerve-wracking being interviewed by Baba lovers. Back in the old days, for example, the LA Baba group would set up Rick Chapman, Robert Dreyfus, and I on killer talk shows like Joe Pine and things like that. And then, in the old days also, we used to set up Baba lovers to call in on talk shows to get the subject over to Baba. And Robert, I'm going to recreate history. I said, Robert, you got to save me because it was in the middle of the night. So he called with a good question that gets us talking. So he called and he says, I've been reading Mayor Baba, and he says there's 7 planes of consciousness and 5 perfect masters. Why not 6? Anyway, that wasn't a scary question. We'll be mindful of time. Well, really, what started my correspondence with Mayor Baba was late 1961, when I reached the 6th plane of consciousness. No, that's right. I had to share that. All right, there's a little history to it. It happened. The experience happened on a hill in upstate New York, reading that section of the Discourses called The Journey of the Souls of the Oversoul to Soul, under the influence of, at that time, very good LSD. And it had just been a couple of weeks after I had heard about it for the first time. In Woodstock, talk by Darwin Shaw, movie lit on, being near the Winterfelds from New York and other Baba lovers. And after I had successfully stolen a book from the bookstore there, I won't do it anymore. Called Sparks, having described in a few paragraphs and sentences that which we of the psychedelic community had been studying ferociously for a year in all Eastern mysticism, this Mayor Baba fellow had summarized in a couple of paragraphs. A good book to steal. And strangely, one of the people in our community at Millbrook had been brought up by a woman who was a Baba lover. I never found out who she was, who had given to him original copies of the very most first Discourses. And we had them in the psychedelic library at that point, at the International Federation for Internal Freedom, which Henry will appreciate, or if it was a chance to talk to him. It was higher risk then than it is now. And anyway, so I decided to take some LSD, and it was a nice day, and I was just going to go out and read the Discourses. Well, when it came to the 6th plane, it was clear. As they say in the old days, I grokked it immediately. And, although that's how I didn't put much significance in that opinion, but it out in my mind that had happened was washed away. So I walked down the hill. A group of itinerant yogic actors were singing this. He said, God, he was taking the book, and the book said sixth plane was pretty good. Well, much later, I realized, much to my chagrin, that I was glowing because I had spent 6 hours in the sun. Totally sunburned. So it did occur to me that people thought the spiritual path was very difficult and spent years, perhaps even centuries, in practices of attainment. And I had figured out with the proper dosage of LSD and this passage, one could zip to the sixth plane relatively quickly. And I said, it's only fair that I should tell the Meher Baba people about this. I said, well, who are the Meher Baba people? I had no record. So I had this, I think I filched, actually it's probably free, a universal message, you know, the little brochure. And it gave a post office box in Myrtle Beach, and the name, A Kitty Davy. So I wrote a letter to Kitty Davy at the Baba Center outlining how this was to be done. And I put down page numbers so nobody, and the appropriate micrograms of LSD would be required. And even I translated the equivalent dosage that would be required if you happen to have psilocybin, mescaline only. Well, the correspondence reached Kitty Davy. And Kitty read the letter. It was in the early days. And she consulted with, I think, Elizabeth Patterson and others down at the center, and they couldn't really come up with an answer to this letter, so they decided to send it to Adi K. Rai. Now, Adi, of course, at that time, was a major communication channel to the West. And Adi, now I didn't know this was happening. And so Adi read the letter. And apparently Adi consulted also with the Mandalay. And they didn't quite know how to respond to it. So despite the fact that Meher Baba was in relatively deep seclusion at the time, they thought they would show the letter to him. So, about a month later, I get this letter from India. And it's a letter from Adi, explaining that he had brought the subject up with Meher Baba. And Meher Baba had said some of the following things. Well, it was a wonderful letter. And it was a very kind and gentle letter. On the other hand, it made things relatively clear. About how, at the very best, such experiences that come from things like LSD could give you a glimpse of the shadow of the very first hints of the astral equivalent of the soul body. If you were lucky. And the rest of the letter had a lot to do with what it was like if you weren't so lucky. And set forth really some of the disadvantages of psychedelic drugs and other drugs in terms of the attainment of higher consciousness. And that began a series of interviews and communications Robert had one, in which Bob, over the next couple of years, developed a fuller and fuller explanation both of the dangers and the pitfalls of drugs for spiritual attainment, and also for certain kinds of drugs in general in terms of their deleterious effects. Although, and setting out how a lot of pharmacological agents could be used legitimately for medical purposes. And so I was very touched by that. And you know, when I was acquainted at that time with what Bob had written, I said, this guy, this is the hippest of the hip. He's the coolest of the cool. And if he says he's God, that's cool with me, because he knows more than anybody we had ever come across. So I doubt, I think it's every 3 years I go back and look at that correspondence. It's a little embarrassing. At least the letters that went out. They weren't, some of the questions I had were not overly profound, but it apparently was a subject of interest in those days. Enough to get replies. I didn't know about seclusion. I knew nothing. We were still out in the boonies insofar as Mayor Bottle was concerned, and in contact. And it was only later, about a year later, where the gang began to coalesce seriously. For a year, I didn't even know what you were supposed to do if you were bottled up. That ignorance remains to this very day. But you know, and later I had to think about it, because and later when in the spring of 1966, I think it was, Bob threw a relative bombshell, at least in the relatively shy and orderly life that Robert, Rick, and I and others had, to go public, to tell the entire nation and the students and young people about the dangers of drugs, and of course to use Bob's authority to do that, which was a little startling at the time. There's implications. I'll come back to that, and we'll finish everything. We'll have both Lucas and Cohenus interruptus experiences. But I mean, Baba said, yeah, it might be, I'm paraphrasing, might be a good idea to read God Speaks, you know, to get an idea of what planes really are about. And there wasn't much literature back then. And so there was extremely, I would say, very compassionate, loving letters from India during this period. And I would ask really dumb questions. My favorite dumb question was, remember there was a big controversy during that period of cryogenic freezing of the body right after death. And I'm reading down through, there's nothing about cryogenic survival. So I said, this certainly is a big enough issue to bother God with. So, among other perhaps legitimate questions about drugs, and which which Baba used, I think, got me stimulated to ask so he could expand upon, was the question, what happens to the soul? You know, this cryogenic thing. But I was thinking, would it hang around this body, or, you know, how would it work? What happened? So, in part of the response, Adi says, in response to your question about cryogenic survival of the soul, says what happens is that the person freezes to death. You know what he's wondering about that, right? They don't drown, they just freeze to death. That's what they do. And anyway, it was later in 1995 when I visited San Francisco, met Don Stevens, Merchants of Jews. They told me, in fact, there really was a kind of avatar path. Huh? Did I say? I told you I had problems with time. It seems like it was just yesterday. And then that letter happened. And please take advantage of it. You should exploit Dreyfus as long as he's here. I have some great stories about that time. And what happened when Baba unleashed the Boston Bible Boy on the world. But that, it's not irrelevant to your question, Clay. I'm being a good interviewee because that was a wonderful time, because even though during Baba's seclusion and up to the last, when he was very ill, it's a subject that he would correspond about, and he would write back. Very much wanted to hear reports and wanted to hear details of talks and how it went in the U.S. and in Europe, etc. It was a wonderful and loving opportunity. I'll end by a sub thing, and one of the things is, you know, one of the reasons that we were exposed to everybody in the old days. Baba was the only spiritual figure who had decently cosmic consciousness, as far as we know, who had a sense of humor, right? And to me, that was critical. That was a critical attribute. And the second element, I think, that we don't give enough attention to, is the notion of what Meher means in terms of compassion, and in terms of his patience, and the things he will go through to generate learning. And just a brief concluding story is that when the letter from Baba came to go public, radio, television, articles, from these itinerant hippies and graduate students who had no access or no credentials for anything, my mind said, I know he's got it. I know he's the avatar. Could he have picked the wrong crew here? And my mind said, you know, you have to get agents to get on these ships. And it got me so nervous that I didn't want to think about it. And in order not to think about it, I remember I went and started reading my kind of psychic National Enquirer, which was called The New Cosmic Star. I know it's going out of business, unfortunately. But it was in reading The New Cosmic Star that I realized fully that Meher Baba knew what he was doing. and that we had to obey, and there was sufficient reason to do it even for the mind. Now, how did that happen? It happened that I had won a subscription to the New Cosmic Star. I had won it in a lottery. Furthermore, I had won it in a lottery in which I had told my girlfriend at the time, I'm going to this psychic symposium, that I was going to win the door prize. And I was willing to bet a bottle of champagne on it. I don't do those things usually. I just knew. And son of a gun, they drew my name out. And son of a gun, I was ready for my new car, or whatever it was. It was a year's subscription to it. But there I was reading things, my mind subconsciously resisting this notion, this impossible task, inexperienced. And remember, we were relatively shy at the time, as I remember, publicly, if not even privately. And then suddenly it came to me. I said, my God, this magazine will take an article about God and drugs. And then I knew it had been a setup from a year ago. That Baba knew I was going to get weak-kneed about this. Made it such a powerful, unlikely event that I would know to go for it. In fact, they did take an article. In fact, later, they did front page articles on Meher Baba. Rick and I, Robert Katrina, became regular columnists before it went out of business. So both by natural correspondence and correspondence with the mechanics of illusion, Meher Baba made it very clear that he'll back you when you do anything for him. With that?